Children. The man paid $30 for her like she was a sack of flour he wasn't sure he wanted. Children. Wren had watched it happen from the corner of the feed store, her wrists bound with rope so old it had gone soft, the kind of soft that doesn't mean kindness, just means worn down. Hector had her by the shoulder, not gripping, not any more. Just resting his hand there the way you rest a hand on something you own, something you don't have to hold tight because where would it go? Children. The stranger across from him didn't look like the kind of man who bought things. Children. He looked like he'd walked out of the Rockies and hadn't bothered to walk back. His coat was buffalo hide, his boots were cracked at the toe, and there was a scar running through his left eyebrow that had never been stitched properly. He wasn't tall the way men puffed themselves tall. He was just large the way a cliff face is large, not trying to be, just there. Children. His name, she would find out later, was Beckett. Children. He stood in the middle of the Hartley Creek trading post in the winter of 1887 and looked at Hector Grail the way a man looks at something that disgusts him so thoroughly. He's gone very still. He didn't look at Wren at all. Children. 30, Beckett said. Children. Hector laughed, which was a wet, unpleasant sound. Boy, she's worth at least. Children. I'm not negotiating. Beckett set 3 coins on the barrel between them. I'm telling you what I'll pay before I decide not to pay anything and just take her. Children. The room got quiet. There were 6 men in that trading post. Not one of them moved. Children. Hector took the coins. Children. Wren didn't understand what had just happened. She kept waiting for the part that made sense, the part where Beckett grabbed her arm, or smiled wrong. Children. Or said something that fit the pattern she'd learned to expect from men in the last 2 years. She waited through the cold walk to his wagon. She waited while he untied her wrists, not carefully, not cruelly. Children. Just efficiently, the way you'd untie a knot in your bootlace. Children. She waited while he climbed up onto the bench and clicked his tongue at the horse. Children. He didn't say anything. Children. The snow had started up again, that fine, dry Alberta snow that doesn't fall so much as hangs in the air, and the horse picked its way up the frozen track out of Hartley Creek, and Wren sat on the bench beside Beckett with her hands in her lap and her heart going so fast she could feel it in her ears. Children. She was 22 years old. She had not had a conversation in 4 months that wasn't an instruction or a threat. She had forgotten slightly what it felt like to be looked at like a person. Children. She wasn't sure she'd been looked at like a person yet. Children. She tested it. Children. Where are you taking me? She said. Not a question. She'd learned not to ask questions. Children. North, Beckett said. About 8 miles. I have a cabin. Children. She waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. Children. And then what? She said. Children. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought, the way a man does when he hasn't decided yet and isn't going to pretend he has. Children. Don't know, he said. I'll figure something out. Children. That was the most terrifying answer she'd ever heard. Children. The cabin was real. That was the first thing. She'd half expected a tent, a lean-to, something temporary that would explain why he hadn't thought further than 8 miles north. But it was a real cabin. Children. Squared logs and a proper stone chimney and a door that shut flush, no gap for the wind. There was a loft overhead with a rope ladder. There was a cast iron stove. Children. There was a shelf of supplies that told her he'd been out here a long time and knew how to last. Children. There was 1 bed. Children. She stood just inside the door and looked at it. Children. Beckett walked past her, knocked the snow off his coat, and fed wood to the stove without looking back. Children. Loft's yours, he said. I'll sleep by the fire. Children. She didn't say thank you. She'd learned that thank you was the first thing men used against you. See, she's grateful. See, she owes me something now. She just looked at the rope ladder, and then at the loft, and then at him, and he wasn't looking at her at all. He was watching the fire catch. Children. She climbed the ladder. Children. There was a straw tick mattress up there, and 2 wool blankets that smelled like cedar and cold air and nothing bad. She lay on top of them with her boots still on, and stared at the rafters and listened to the sound of him moving around below, the ordinary sounds of a person making a meal, water into a pot, something scraping against iron, and she waited for the sounds to change into something else. Children. They didn't. Children. After a while she smelled broth. Venison, she thought. Her stomach moved in a way that was embarrassing. Children. There's food, he called up. Children. She didn't come down for a long time. When she did, he'd set a bowl on the table and gone back to the fire with his own, and he didn't look up when she came down the ladder, and he didn't look up when she sat down, and he didn't say anything about how long she'd waited. Children. The broth was good. It was the best thing she'd eaten since September. Children. She ate all of it and set the bowl down, and he still wasn't looking at her, and she thought, with a feeling she didn't have a word for, that she might survive this. Children. The first 3 days she didn't speak unless she had to. Children. She watched him. It was a habit she'd developed, the same way you develop any survival skill. You learn to read the room before the room reads you. She watched for the signs. Children. The ones she'd catalogued over 2 years of being passed from one man's authority to another. The way the jaw tightened before the voice rose. Children. The way the eyes went flat and inward before something got thrown. The way certain silences meant something was building. Children. Beckett's silences meant nothing. That was the strangest thing. He could sit with silence the way most men couldn't sit still. Just let it be there. Fill up the room, breathe. He wasn't building to anything. He was just quiet. Children. He split wood in the mornings. He checked the trap lines in the afternoons. He came back smelling like cold and pine resin, and sometimes blood. But the blood was always animal and always clean. He cooked simply and without complaint. He mended things. He read, which surprised her. A worn Bible and a battered copy of something by a man named Trollope, which she had never heard of. Children. He didn't touch her. Children. Not once. Not even the accidental brush of hands she'd started bracing herself against every time she had to pass close by him in the small space. He just didn't. He moved around her the way you move around someone you've chosen to give room to. Children. On the 4th day she came downstairs in the morning and found he'd left a pair of wool socks on the bottom rung of the ladder. Her feet had been cold. She hadn't said so. Children. She picked up the socks and turned them over in her hands, and something cracked open a little in her chest that she immediately shut back down. Children. She put the socks on. She didn't say anything, neither did he. Children. The question came out of her on a Tuesday, or what she thought was Tuesday. She hadn't been counting carefully. Children. He'd come in from the trap lines with a bruised hand. Slipped on ice. He said nothing serious, and she'd watched him try to wrap it himself and do it badly, and finally she'd said, without meaning to, "Give it here," and he'd looked at her with mild surprise and then held out his hand. Children. She wrapped it. She'd learned how in the months she'd spent at the Garfield station, when she'd made herself useful enough in the kitchen to stay out of worse situations. Her hands knew what to do, even when her head was somewhere else. Children. When she finished, she didn't let go right away. She just held his hand, this large, battered hand that had paid $30 for her and then done nothing else frightening. And she looked at it, and then she said it. Children. Do you hit open-handed or closed? Children. She felt him go still. Children. Not the kind of still that meant anger building. A different kind. The kind a person goes when they've been struck somewhere they didn't expect. Children, neither, he said. Children. She looked up at him. Children. I haven't hit anyone in 11 years, he said, and that man was trying to put a knife in my back. He paused, and I didn't feel good about it. Children. Wren let go of his hand. Children. She sat back and looked at the wall for a long time, and the fire snapped, and the wind moved over the roof, and Beckett didn't fill the silence with anything, just let her have it. Children. I didn't know that was possible, she said finally. She wasn't sure she'd meant to say it out loud. Children. Beckett picked up his Bible from the table and then set it back down without opening it. Children. I know, he said. Children. That was all. But it sat in the room differently than most things people said. It sat like it weighed something. Children. She started coming down earlier in the mornings. Children. Not because she'd made a decision. More because staying in the loft started to feel like the stranger choice, and decisions that small are really just habit rearranging itself without asking permission. She'd come down, and the stove would already be going, and there would be coffee, actual coffee, which Beckett made strong enough to stop your heart, and somehow it was the best part of the day. Children. She started to talk. A little. About nothing at first. The weather, the sound the pines made when the wind came off the mountains, whether she thought the snow would hold. He talked back in the same measure, not too much, not too little, like he was calibrating to her without knowing he was doing it. Children. She told him about Lethbridge, where she'd grown up, her mother's garden, the way the prairie looked in July, golden all the way to the edge of the world. She told him about her father, who was a decent man until he wasn't anymore, and then she stopped, and he didn't ask her to continue. Children. He told her about Ontario, which surprised her. She'd assumed he was Western-born, something about the way he wore the landscape on him. He told her he'd come west at 23, looking for something he couldn't have named, and had found the mountains instead, which turned out to be enough. Children. Do you miss it? She asked. Ontario. Children. I miss the maple trees in fall, he said. Nothing else. Children. She thought about that. Children. I miss my mother's garden, she said, the sweet peas. She grew them on a trellis by the back door. I can still smell them if I think hard enough. Children. That's a good thing to carry, he said. Children. She had not thought of it as carrying. She'd thought of it as haunting. But those were different words, for the same weight, she supposed. Children. Hector found them in February. Children. She heard the horse first. She was inside, mending a tear in her dress sleeve, and Beckett was at the woodpile, and she heard a horse coming up the track, and she knew the same way the body knows things before the mind catches up. She knew whose horse it was. Children. She went to the door. Children. Beckett had already turned. He stood with the axe in his hand, not raised, just held, and he watched Hector Grail come up through the snow on the gray mare, and he didn't say anything. Children. Hector pulled up 20 feet out. He looked different than she remembered. Smaller, somehow, which might have been the cold, or might have been what happens when you see someone you feared in a place where they have less power. Children. That's my property you're harboring, Hector said. Children. No, Beckett said. Children. I got papers. Children. There are no papers, Beckett said. That make a woman property in this territory. You should know that. He paused. You do know that. You're counting on me not knowing it. Children. Hector's face changed. She watched it, that particular shift, the one that meant he was calculating, reassessing, deciding which way to push. Children. She put her coat on. Children. She walked out the door. Children. Beckett glanced at her sideways, not warning her off, she realized, just noticing. Children. She walked out into the snow and stood next to Beckett, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and she looked at Hector Grail, who had taken 2 years of her life and kept them, and she said, "Children, you should go." Children. Hector looked at her. He looked at Beckett. He looked back at her, and whatever he saw in her face, she didn't know what was in her face. She'd stopped being able to feel it, but whatever it was, it made him pull the mare's head around. "Children, this isn't finished," he said. "Children." "It is," Beckett said. "Children." Hector rode away through the snow, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded, and then there was just the wind and the pines and the cold, and the two of them standing there in the yard. "Children." She didn't move for a long time. "Children." Beckett didn't move either. "Children, you didn't have to come out," he said. "Children." "I know," she said. "Children." She hadn't done it for him. She'd done it for herself, for the version of herself that was still crouched in the corner of some room, somewhere waiting for the sounds to change into something worse, and needed to see what it looked like to stand in a yard and not flinch. Children. She'd done it for Wren, who was 22 years old and from Lethbridge, and could still smell her mother's sweet peas if she thought hard enough, and who was going to need to remember this moment later when things were hard again, which they would be, because things always were. Children. Beckett nodded. Once like that made complete sense to him. Children. They went inside. Children. Spring came slowly the way it always does in the foothills, not arriving so much as remembering itself in stages, a warm afternoon, here a mud season week there, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first. Wren noticed she'd stopped cataloging the sounds in the night. That was how she knew something had shifted. Not a moment, not a decision, just the absence of a habit she'd stopped needing. Children. She wrote a letter to her mother. Beckett had paper and ink, and he didn't ask who it was for. Children. She didn't know if her mother was still on the Lethbridge property, or if she'd gone to her sister's in Medicine Hat, or if she was even. She cut that thought off. She addressed the letter to Lethbridge and gave it to the post rider, who came through in March, and she let it go. Children. Beckett asked her once what she wanted. Children. Not what she was going to do, not where she was going, what she wanted. The difference felt significant. She sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with a question you've been saving room for, without knowing it. Children. I want to learn to read better than I can, she said. I can read, but not well. She paused. I want to grow something. A garden, maybe, if the ground here lets you. Another pause. I want to stop dreaming about Hector Grail. Children. Beckett was quiet. Children. The reading I can help with, he said. The ground here's rocky, but people have done it. I'll build you a raised bed in April. He looked at her. The last one, that one just takes time, and something to replace it. Children. Replace it with what, she said. Children. Something worth dreaming about instead, he said. Children. She didn't know what that was yet, but she thought, sitting in that cabin with the early March light coming pale through the oilskin window and coffee going cold on the table between them, that she might be starting to find out. Not because Beckett had saved her, she'd stopped believing in that kind of saving a long time ago, children, but because she was still here and the ground was thawing, and she had a letter out in the world making its way to Lethbridge, and she was 22 years old, which turned out to still be young enough. Children. That was more than she'd known how to want 2 months ago. Children. For now it was enough. Children. I keep coming back to that one question, not the big dramatic moments, not Hector riding away through the snow, not the $30 on the barrel. Just a girl sitting across from a man who'd wrapped her wrist gently, holding his hand and asking whether he hit open-palmed or closed-fisted. As if those were the only two options the world had ever given her to choose between. Children. That's what 2 years of cruelty does to a person. It doesn't just hurt you, it teaches you to reorganize the whole world around the pain. Wren didn't ask Beckett if he was kind. She didn't know yet that kindness was something she was allowed to ask for. She only knew how to ask which kind of harm was coming. Children. And I think about what it cost Beckett to sit with that. To not explain himself, not defend himself, not fill the silence with reassurance that she hadn't earned a reason to trust yet. He just said, "Neither, children," and let it land and waited. That's not instinct. That's something a person builds in themselves slowly, over time, children, by choosing to pay attention to what other people actually need, instead of what makes you feel better about yourself. That's what I'd call real moral backbone. Not loudly, children, just quietly every day in the small choices nobody sees. Children. What struck me about Wren, though, what I couldn't stop thinking about, is that she didn't wait to be saved. She learned to read because she wanted to, children. She planned a garden because the ground was there and spring was coming. She walked out into the yard and stood next to Beckett, not because he needed her to, but because she needed herself to, children. That's a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one morning and puts its boots on. Children. There's a cause and effect in this story that I think matters. Hector treated Wren like something with a price tag, and the consequence of that, the one he didn't see coming, was that she became exactly the kind of person who could stand in a yard and send him away. The smallness of his thinking is what undid him. He counted dollars and didn't bother to count the person, children. And Beckett, who counted the person first and the dollars last, ended up with something no amount of $30 transactions could have bought him. Children. I don't think that's an accident. I think how you treat people, really consistently in the moments no one's watching, tends to come back around in some form, not as punishment and reward in any tidy sense, just as consequence. The world has a long memory for how we move through it. Children. What Wren had to figure out, and what I think is the hardest thing any person ever figures out, is that surviving something terrible doesn't automatically make you free. Freedom is a separate project, children. It takes time and a raised garden bed and letters sent to Lethbridge and enough quiet mornings with good coffee that you slowly stop listening for what the sounds are turning into. It takes, in other words, children, the willingness to keep going even when going feels like too much to ask, children. That particular determination to rebuild yourself out of whatever's left is maybe the most important thing a person can grow in themselves. Children. She was 22. She still had all that time ahead of her. Children. That's the part I find myself holding on to.